Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com. Join me at Sonic Cinema Patreon at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. There you'll get early access to certain reviews for older movies. This month includes one for Dario Argento's Suspiria, as well as some quick take reviews on movies I've seen for the first time during my October horror movies. I've also got plenty of other content regarding my music as well as thoughts on movies. It's at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Today, we're going to celebrate the birthday that's just passed for one of the most famous filmmakers of all time. That's not really something that should be in dispute, especially after the past 30, 40 years of how his legacy has grown through retrospective consideration of his work, as well as a very popular and Oscar-winning biopic by Tim Burton, is the work of Edward D. Wood Jr. And I'm joined today by a couple of friends to discuss. We're going to talk about the Tim Burton film, but I want to focus a little bit more on Ed Wood's filmography, which includes Glen or Glenda, Plan 9 from Outer Space, and Bride of the Monsters. I'm pleased to be joined by Mathew and Bailey Timms. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
And shameless plug for Operation BSU, which I also occasionally appear on.
So in 2005, a chain of stores was closing down called Media Play. Was basically the equivalent of, I guess you could say, like Second and Charles right now, where they had like movies and music and books and all of that stuff. And they had all of their inventory on discount. Well, for Christmas that year, my mother got me a box set that I was not expecting as a result of these deals. It was an Ed Wood box set, which included Glen or Glenda, Jailbait, Bride of the Monster, Night of the Ghouls, and Plan 9 from Outer Space. It was between that and a film noir box set, and I'm glad she made the choice she did. Not just because of the fact that by this point, I was long time a big fan of the Tim Burton biopic with Johnny Depp on Ed Wood, but I was curious. I was excited to actually see the films themselves, and I have gone through all of those just watching them clean, no riff tracks or Mystery Science Theater or anything like that. Over the years, you can see those reviews on Sonic Cinema. Before we get into this discussion, I would like to have Matt and Bailey get into what drew them to Ed Wood and his films. Was it the Tim Burton film? Was it just finding out about them and seeing them outright, and just sort of get your histories with Ed Wood?
So for me, it was kind of interesting because kind of like with the David Lynch discussion we've had previously, at first I didn't really get it. Mm-hmm. I saw a couple of his movies on TV late night. I saw him on MST3K, and I knew this reputation about this goofy guy who made bad movies, and I didn't really get it. And it was partially the Church of Ed Wood, reading their stuff and kind of being amused by it. Mm-hmm. And it was the biopic that kind of all made it click. And I started to realize that, yeah, these movies are bad. Sure, they're poorly made and whatever else. And it's funny to watch the tombstones fall over. But there's something about his passion and how much of himself he put into it that really fascinated me. And, of course, that's what won me over, is that kind of passion and originality and wanting it so badly you didn't necessarily care. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
I came to Ed Wood a little bit more by necessity than design. We couldn't afford cable, So occasionally you'd pop on one of the late night showings and you'd see Plan 9 pop up, or never Glenn or Glenda, nothing,
Yeah.
nothing controversial. But it came twofold, because in high school I finally had Plan 9 explained. I had a teacher, AP English, that said that for Halloween every year we would watch Plan 9 from Outer Space. And if you left to go to the restroom, the movie would be paused until you returned. If we didn't get to watch most of the movie during the period, we would start over the next day.
Yeah.
There was no way you could avoid seeing any part of this horrible film. And he would pop in with commentary. It was before any of the high schoolers had really been exposed to MST3K. So it was this great experience of being in a class full of my friends, watching this horrible movie, being allowed to talk during a movie, that made me go, maybe I should investigate what this guy's up to, because it's bringing my friends together. And then I kind of fell in love with the goodness and the badness. I've also been a Full Moon fan for forever, and Trauma and things like that. So bad movies were already kind of in my purview.
Well, there's something about that I want to talk about more sort of in generally.
Okay.
That I kind of love the independent spirit that today you see that with Trauma, you see that with Full Moon. I love that idea of, I'm going to make what I want to make and let's hope it sells. And I love that Lloyd Kaufman is this outsized personality, and I love that he shows up to cons with people dressed up as his characters, and I love, it's that same kind of showmanship that Hitchcock had, just skewed a little bit differently. It's that William Castle thing.
It's William Castle, and Hitchcock had a baby, and it looks as ugly as Lloyd Kaufman.
But has the comic timing of Mel Brooks.
Yeah.
Yes.
I kind of want to see how this conception occurred. I really do. There's got to be a documentary made on that.
Well, and I came to Ed Wood because of the Tim Burton film, and it's like I hadn't seen Plan 9 from Outer Space. It wasn't until I got the box set that I think I had rented Plan 9 from Outer Space after, in Glen or Glenda, after the Tim Burton film. I don't think I'd seen any of the other ones, even on MST3K. I think I'd missed those episodes until the box set. So one of the things that I made Ed Wood, one of the columns I do on Sonic Cinema is a movie a week, where I try to watch a movie a week, whether it's something new to me or whether it's something that I've seen before, and I review it fresh based off of a fresh viewing. And a few years ago, about 6 years ago, I think, I made Ed Wood my bookend filmmaker. Basically, every year for these, I would bookend the year with one particular filmmaker that I was interested in or I just really admire, whether somebody like Andrei Tarkovsky, Kurosawa, and Bergman were the first ones, and then Ed Wood was next.
You're so classy, Brian.
Now, what would he think to know that he's in that same collection?
Well, and the thing is, it's like, I think because by that point, Ed Wood is, it's like one of the things, if you're new to watching films, it's like one of the first things I think you're going to find out is, he has a reputation for being the worst filmmaker of all time. I think anybody who sees a certain amount of films, however, can plainly see that he's not the worst filmmaker of all time.
They have not seen Dumpster Baby. They have not seen Dumpster.
Or Manos.
They haven't seen Manos. They haven't seen Monster Go-Go. They haven't seen half the crap that Mystery Science Theater's done over the years.
Street Trash. They've clearly never seen Street Trash.
I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, Ed Wood, his movies are not good. That is very clear. If you watch his movies, they're low budget. They're not particularly well acted. They're not good movies. But
he does have a tenure for dialogue. Don't forget that.
hey, you know what? Yeah, I can't forget that. And you know, cops making in natural use of guns to prop up their the bills of their hats.
And just scratching the side of your head.
Yeah,
with it.
exactly.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I will say about Ed Wood, and this is where I would take him out of the realm of worst filmmaker of all time, is the fact that you can always tell that there's an enthusiasm for filmmaking, and there's a very clear voice for filmmaking. And that's one of the reasons that I made him a bookend filmmaker, is because I do think even if his films are not great, and they're not, there's a voice in there that's wanting to come out, and that's one of the things that interests me so much about him.
I feel like Ed Wood is a representation of every wannabe filmmaker.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like he is a bit of our voice. He speaks out and says, you know what? I got somebody to fund a little bit of this. You can probably get your much better film made.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and there's something, again, about that passion that I really related to. And I love how, almost in the same way that Hitchcock's films are very personal to him, or John Waters, like he just take things that interest them and that obsess them, and somehow find a way to work a narrative around it.
Yeah.
And I love that it's not just like a cynical thing. It's a way of bringing your passions to life and sharing them with people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, especially something like Glen or Glenda, which, if you know anything about Ed Wood's history, I mean, you know, it doesn't even, you know, I mean, you get glimpses of it in the Tim Burton film, but I mean, just in general, it's like Glen or Glenda is obviously a very personal project for him. It's a tonal mess. It's a disaster of narrative, but it's a personal project to him, and that's one of the things that is it. You can't help but watch it. You can't help but be intrigued by it.
It's his My Best Fiend by Herzog.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't remember the exact wording, but Penn Jillette of Penn and Teller summed up very nicely, and he was talking about how pure Ed Wood's writing is. There's something about that feels unfiltered, like it just poured right out of his skull.
Yeah.
And there's a certain, I hate to reuse it, but purity to it, where there isn't, it feels almost like Glen or Glenda is a great example, because here's the cross-dressing, which I'm very passionate about. Here's the look at norms and sexuality. Oh, and I love Bela Lugosi. Let's put him in too.
Yeah.
And there's this sense that I don't care if it goes together or not. I just love these things, and I want them in my movie.
I believe the style you're referring to is we don't need no stinking editors.
Well, and always shoot the first draft, because the first draft is perfect when it comes to the screenplay.
Well, it reminds me of an episode of Futurama where Harold Zoidberg's uncle, they say, well, we've just finished this print. Editing is a costly and time expansive process, so the premiere will be ready next week.
Yeah.
Well, and that's like, if you look at the early John Waters films, like they are probably about equally crude in terms of production. They're just like a master shot with a little zooming, and there's no cutaways, there's no other angles, there's no coverage. And so there's a certain sense that, like, when the film gets out of the can, it's done. Like,
you don't make a cut off a master.
And I love that he was able to make fun of himself, too. Yes. And I feel that same Ed Wood spirit in Cecil B. Demented. And I love the sort of self-reflection and the willingness to make fun of yourself that shows.
I'm pretty sure Cecil B. Demented is John Waters' biopic. That's... he chose to make himself much cuter and strangely heterosexual, but it works.
Well, he wore a straitjacket. It works.
But I do want to say, in the research for coming onto the show, we watched...
We watched the biopic, Night of the Ghouls. Yeah.
Night of the Ghouls. And I was impressed with Night of the Ghouls. Like,
yeah.
It has got a clear narrative. It has got a great... like the A plot of Night of the Ghouls I loved. Like if he had kept it without the supernatural aspect, I would have like A++. Will do business with again best movie of 2018. I mean, it was remarkably well paced, well plotted. The dialogue was not as bad, and then Matt informed me that he didn't do most of the work on it, so I see why it's so good.
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, basically what had happened was what had happened was they filmed the movie and they put together a work print, which Paul Marco says they screened at one point, and Ed had some extra footage of Lugosi he wanted to add. And but unfortunately he couldn't afford the lab fees, so the lab held the positives hostage. And it wasn't until 1982, I've got this here, a man named
These are meticulously written out note cards for the audience at home.
Wade Williams wanted to buy the rights to Plan 9 from his widow, and she said, "Oh, there's another film you've not seen." And he was able to pay the positive cost and get the film edited and put together. And and it's one of those things where I think part of that conciseness and clarity is the fact that he didn't do the editing.
Yeah. And when I learned that after watching Night of the Ghouls for the first time, it's like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. That wasn't him finishing it. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, I do think that's one of his better films, especially of the ones that are not even taking that out of the equation that somebody else edited it. I think it certainly feels more like his storytelling is not as choppy and as silly.
It feels like he finally got to tell a story the way he really wanted to.
Yeah.
Instead of it just being a mishmash of ideas, it makes me wonder what would have happened if he had let someone else help a little bit. Would he be the worst filmmaker ever made, or would he be the seminal sci-fi creator of the 50s?
I don't know that I would necessarily go that far. I mean, there's some good competition there. I do think he probably would have had better reputation.
I've seen The Creeping Terror, Brian. I don't know how much competition there really is.
Yeah, do you really want to put that up against The Crawling Eye and see what happens?
Okay.
That's one of the things that really, when I had this reputation, worst filmmaker ever, and I really dove in and started watching these movies again in earnest, I realized that, oh yeah, like these are goofy, dialogue's not good, stuff falls over, but they're eminently more watchable than basically so many of these other films. And I think that if you encounter Plan 9 for the first time, not understanding that, it does seem awful. But when you look at some of these other films and think about how cheaply they were thrown together, you look at The Screaming Skull and how like nothing happens and it's just dull, and it's easier to go, oh yeah, so there's something special here. There's something kind of unique about it.
And it feels like the people that made the decision that Ed Wood was the worst filmmaker were not, teenagers in the 90s, which had to deal with VHS or straight-to-video horror movies. I have picked up some films that make Ed Wood's films look like Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually one thing I wanted to kind of get at real quick is I feel like there's classes of bad films. I feel like Manos is kind of the bottom floor. Yeah, so what?
Yeah.
Like Manos is the bottom floor because it was just made on a dare. Like, I bet I can make a movie.
Right.
Doesn't matter if it's good. I made it,
Right.
And then, there's some, but there's also another class where you have something like, the easy reference would be Twilight, like where you have great cinematography, marvelous score, wonderful actors. It's just that the story's not there. And the movie's dull, but it's not poorly made.
Well, and I will say this about Twilight, wonderful actors acting poorly.
Because they're given nothing to work with. Yeah.
They're given a Mormon dating manual to turn into a narrative film.
With vampires.
Sparkly vampires.
Well, and there's also, the fact that the first 3 movies have enough narrative to really make one movie,
Yeah.
And they just kind of keep stretching it.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, like, that's not the actor's fault. They're just not given anything worthwhile to work with.
Mm-hmm. Well, and no, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, there are definitely so many different styles of bad filmmaking. I mean, I would, you know, it's like you look at you know, you mentioned Twilight. I mean, that's
It's an easy
one.
target, but
Oh, it's definitely an easy one. Then you have, if you want to go bigger movies, I mean, you've got something like the last few Michael Bay Transformers movies, which are just atrociously written and paced. It's ridiculous. There's no reason it needs to be 2.5 hours at all.
Yeah.
And
well, that's how long it takes Michael Bay to finish. Yeah.
Well, and the thing is, it's like then you have somebody like, you also have somebody like Uwe Boll, who's sort of, I would put him below Ed Wood as far as filmmakers, because yeah, he's got money to make these movies, but
they're all tax shelters.
Yeah, and they're atrociously written, performed.
yeah, we need to find out how to get
Shot.
some of that tax shelter money.
We really
Yeah.
do.
Well, with our luck, it would be like the Monty Python and the Holy Grail thing. It would be that producers thing where they, you know, they give us a bunch of money thinking this is just going to be a tax write-off, and then it's become successful. So
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I've seen more, and I refuse to pronounce his name correctly. He has not earned it. Bowl
Yeah.
movies than I care to admit to, because only people who make good movies get their names pronounced right. Okay, that's why Michael Bay.
anyone else thinking about the substitute teacher from Key and Peele here?
Yes. I mean, Jay Quellen would totally agree. So would Aaron.
Yeah.
Our references are just bouncing everywhere. I think we're making your podcast more, what's the word, relatable to other fans.
Well, and the thing is, it's like this is inevitably how movie discussions go. I think it's like you have this one base topic, and then you can branch out, and especially with something like Ed Wood, you're talking about bad films. I mean, I'm putting that in air quotes, but I mean, you know, they're bad films, but like Matthew said, there's, like you guys said, there are different degrees of bad films. There are different types of bad films.
And I often sort of wonder, I guess this is slightly philosophical, but is it fair to judge something that was shot in 4 days with $10,000 on the same scale that you judge a multi-million-dollar production? Like, I feel like, in a way, something in the Twilight ilk is actually worse because they had much more to work with.
Oh yeah, that's why honestly, admittedly, that's part of the reason why I have no problem giving Ed Wood a pass to a large degree, because yeah, he didn't have. Not saying his films would have necessarily been better with more of a budget, but I think he did better with what he had than most people do.
Well, and
with
Night of the Ghouls shows,
times
you know, there's
as
growth.
much.
Yeah.
So,
Well, being someone who's dated a lot of directors, I've seen what you can do with $2,000 in an afternoon. I've seen what you can do with $5,000 in 3 days, and I've seen what you can do with $10,000 in a week. And Ed Wood did remarkably well, considering I was part of a film called Night of the Dark Evil Magic.
I am sorry. Every time you bring that up, I am sorry.
I know. I mean, we really need to get that. That needs to be the closure I have, is me getting apologized to for being a part of that.
But yeah, like, in a way, the fact that some of these movies came together at all is a miracle.
yeah.
Like, you look at Plan 9 especially, you've got A Star Is Dead, A Star Who Won't Talk, you've got, you know, a lot of stuff you've got to work around. It's amazing he came out with any film at all.
And I want to point out that she totally contradicted herself in that interview, speaking specifically of Vampira, the star that wouldn't talk. She said that she thought her character would be better not speaking, whereas other things we've heard in the past would imply that she refused to speak. So I really want to know the actual story, and we never will.
Well, that's
Yeah.
actually one of the things that I find most fascinating about the biopic and about the book that's based on. Nightmare of Ecstasy by Rudolph Gray was an oral history. It was in that
No,
"Please
available
don't
on
kill me"
Amazon.
style, and it was fascinating because there's this Rashomon thing going through the whole thing, where one person says something very definitively, and then the next person contradicts it very directly. And even though it is, as Criswell said, based on the sworn testimony of
Yeah.
those who survived this horrific ordeal, there's still a lot of points where you have to kind of go, you kind of, and when you're crafting a slightly fictionalized narrative, you've got to kind of give a little bit and say, well, maybe it happened this way. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of fascinated with how they were able to shape a coherent film out of all these contradictions. And it also kind of fascinates me that because this is stuff that until fairly recently was forgotten, we're never going to know the real truth about most of this. There is going to be it's going to be layers of rumor and innuendo, and I kind of am fascinated by the fact that, like the Joker said, the history is multiple choice.
Yeah.
Like, we're never going to get a clear definition of this is exactly how this happened. And I think that might be a good transition to get into the Tim Burton film a little bit, if you'd like.
Okay. Yeah, we can definitely do that. And I will say I have a soft spot for movies about filmmaking and stuff like that. I mean, a big part of it starts with Ed Wood. I mean, there are other fantastic ones, but I mean, Ed Wood's a big part of it, the Tim Burton film. And it's you start off with Ed Wood, played by Johnny Depp, one of his best performances still.
And for any younger folks that might be listening, there was a time when you wanted Johnny Depp in your movie.
Yeah.
There was a time where he was an indie darling. And
Yeah.
There was a time where women flocked to theaters at the idea of Johnny Depp showing up.
Especially in a dress.
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, okay, I think that's just me. That's like, oh, Johnny Depp in a dress. Oh, my God.
Now, I'm pretty sure there's a certain underground following in that degree. And this was also a time when Tim Burton was at the height of his powers. And
Oh, yeah, because he was coming off of Edward Scissorhands, Batman Returns, the first two Batman movies, and then he had they'd just done Nightmare Before Christmas with Henry Selick. And yeah, so I love Ed Wood. What are the names of the writers?
Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski.
Yeah, I didn't want to say them because I can't pronounce them to say the Karaszewskis.
Yeah, it took some time to find that one. I had to research the pronunciation.
But I definitely had to mention those writers because they went on to do fantastic other biopics, The Pupil versus Larry Flint and Man on the Moon for Miller Forman. And it's another, and all three of those are basically about oddball characters following their passions in one way or the other and changing how we view what they do.
Interesting sidebar. In Lawrenceville, Georgia, you can see the bullet hole from where Larry Flint was shot at.
Yeah, we went on a walking tour. It was a ghost tour, and they pointed that out. It was kind of fascinating.
Just thought that would be a good sidebar to include. We're here to help tourism to Georgia, right?
Yeah, of course.
Well, especially if you're going to be here because you're making movies, you might as well stop by.
And that is definitely one of the big things in Georgia is to make movies.
Yeah.
But I really...
Please hire us. All of us.
I love Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski. They're brilliant writers, and I love, biopics are a really hard genre because either they're like Cradle to the Grave movies where it's just like 2 minutes of each year and it's kind of, you don't have context for anything and it's kind of dull, or one thing that bothers me a lot is a lot of biopics tend to shape the narrative in a way that just makes it look like other movies. Like, Okay, so let's say you're an alien and you're seeing Earth culture for the first time. Let's say you see Ray and Walk the Line relatively close to each other.
Right.
If you didn't know these were based on real people, wouldn't you just assume that one was a remake of the other? Like, oh, so we took the same story and we just made it a country singer. Okay.
Yeah, I mean no, you're yeah. Even in the '90s, I mean, you had that very standard biopic, historical drama type thing. I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes Tim Burton. I mean, other than the fact that it's very obvious they have personal connection to the films of Ed Wood. I mean, if you've watched any of Tim Burton's work at all, I mean, that would come through. It's
That
like
spirit, yeah.
he's the, he's the type of filmmaker that would see the appreciation that we've talked about as far as Ed Wood. Obviously there's a passion for Ed Wood, have passion for filmmaking, even if he didn't necessarily have the talent or the finances to necessarily put it together into great art.
Well, Ed Wood is my favorite. It's my favorite biopic, and it's also my favorite Tim Burton film. There's something about it that just speaks to me.
Same with me on both counts.
And a lot of the things are Alexander and Karaszewski's influence. Like, I love the way they're able to take these disparate, contradicting stories and work them in together and say, well, maybe. And if you read Nightmare of Ecstasy, it's amazing how many different points are covered in the movie somewhere or other. Like the average person making a biopic would actually show him in the war and would show him, getting knocked in the teeth by a Japanese soldier. But in this one, they just play with the dentures and talk about it. I love how they did something that's essentially uncinematic, but made it work. Mm-hmm. Like the whole idea that you're supposed to show rather than tell actually doesn't work here. A lot of times you're just hanging out with the characters and getting bits here and there. You're getting a little bit about the fact that he was from Poughkeepsie. You're getting the fact that...
you get to say Poughkeepsie.
Yeah, that's always great. You're getting the fact that Loretta King was supposedly allergic to liquids. Like, all these little weird things that normally wouldn't make it into another movie are there. And
I believe the influence for your next podcast here is how is one allergic to liquids? That should be the basis.
An investigative...
That could be the investigative journalism branch.
Yeah. Sonic Cinema now presenting...
Allergic to Liquids, the Loretta King story.
But yeah, I love how everything that's you're not supposed to do, they kind of did in this movie, and it all works.
Oh, no, it's Nightmare in Silica. Okay.
Oh, actually, not bad, and there's so many things about it. Like, biopics are finally starting to wise up. Like, if you see the National Lampoon one, what was it?
A Futile and
Stupid Gesture and I, Tonya, those films both address the camera and talk about contradictions, and they talk about things that are faked and wrong. And they're finally starting to get to the point where they allow the audience to be hip enough to understand that this isn't perfect.
I feel like the addressing of the breaking the fourth wall in a biopic is absolutely acceptable. And I love a nuanced portrayal of anyone. I don't want to see something that makes them golden. I don't want to see something that makes them terrible. I want to see who this person actually is.
And at the time of this recording, Bohemian Rhapsody hasn't come out yet.
Yeah.
But I'm so sad that they didn't go for that like warts and all interpretation that Sacha Baron Cohen wanted.
Yeah. You can't see me rolling my eyes, but it's very important.
That could have made such an amazing movie. And instead, I'm sure the one that's going to come out, I'm sure it's going to be colorful and fun, and it's going to have all our favorite songs. But it just, I don't really care to see it because it doesn't have that same kind of life to it.
Yeah. I feel like you'd get the same joy listening to a Queen album.
Probably,
I mean, probably more joy listening to Queen.
And you'll probably feel like you understand Freddie Mercury just a bit more doing so than just watching a 2-hour, 15-minute movie that's watered down.
Yeah, listen to Fat Bottom Girls 6 times in a row, and you will understand everything you needed to know about Freddie Mercury right there. Maybe Don't Stop Me Now and Bicycle Race. Then you're done.
Well, another thing about biopics that makes this one really unique that I love is that they cut out weird stuff. Normally, like in films, they bend the truth to make it a little more interesting, or they bend it to act like other movies. But there's so many fascinating things that they just didn't have time to include.
Mm-hmm.
Like one thing that really interests me is that Ed got his first film camera at the age of 12, and he actually got footage of the Hindenburg before it crashed.
Oh, wow.
And that's amazing. And I
Yeah.
don't, that's a detail where it's not important to the story, but it's just kind of fascinating to know.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the fact that Criswell was raised in a funeral home, and he owned the coffin that they brought to Night of the Ghouls, and he's rumored to have slept in it too. And like, there's all these things that didn't entirely make the movie, but are kind of hinted at.
Yeah.
And I love the fact they were able to pull in references to things they didn't include.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you look at the backgrounds of some of the scenes where they're shooting the movie, there's a set for a scene that we're not going to get to see filmed. I really love the fact that they put that much dedication into recreating these things
Yeah.
that we're not even going to get to see used.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really one of the things that is fascinating. And I mean, I think when you have biopics, it's like ultimately you have to be judicious as far as like what story are you telling. And so I mean, I think it made sense for them to go with, okay, the story we're going to tell the one that I think emotionally is going to be the most entertaining for people is the story of Ed Wood and Bela Lugosi,
Right.
and their friendship. And I mean, and you can encapsulate a lot of stuff in that. And like you were talking about, just these quick little references to just different things in his life
that really frame him as a person too.
Yeah.
Like, I honestly feel like because of that biopic that I could make a friendship with Ed Wood, because I understand so much of who he is, even without the additional biographical details that I know from being around Matt at all, ever. You know how there's that one person's obsessed with serial killers? This is Matt with Ed Wood. Occasionally things will just pop out into the conversation you weren't expecting.
Yeah.
Like, did you know Ed Wood had a terrier? It's just randomly pops in.
I forgot what kind of dogs they had, but there was, there's this delightful picture
He
in
actually
Nightmare of
knows.
Ecstasy that has this tiny little dog called Monster. He's a Dutchtown size, but I don't think that's the actual breed. It's been too long since I've seen it. But it's got, Ed wearing slacks and a shirt and a tie with the Angora sweater over it, kneeling down to play with the dog. And it was named by Bella. They called him, said it was a cute little monster, and so that's where the name came from.
That's actually also how I was named. I changed it in my 20s.
But yeah, and there's something, I love the subtlety of the way the film is presented. I think that it's the best cinematography and lighting of any Tim Burton film.
Yeah.
It's just the most visually striking in a way that's interesting because it's not as fantastical as his other films.
It's not his house style at all.
Yeah.
And yet it's definitively Tim Burton. It's a beautifully made film. I would say if I didn't know, though, that it was Tim Burton, I might not guess because, A, there's no stripes anywhere to be spotted whatsoever. Nothing pops out of anywhere. It's fairly...
Well, and I love some of the subtle little touches. Like, I love that there's that giant painting of Dracula that they sit underneath, and so the shadow of Dracula is hanging over Bella at all times.
Yeah.
And I love the way they handle the drugs, kind of off camera, off to the side.
Yeah.
I love that even though you never see footage of Ed getting sloppy drunk, if you look at the frame, there's always a bottle of whiskey next to the typewriter. There's always he's taking one drink here and there. I love the idea that these things that are not outright explored are still present in the story.
Well, and things that would come up in a different director's story much more obviously.
Yeah.
We love, as a culture, to highlight the absolute worst that we can see in someone that's elevated. We love to say, oh, well, Ed Wood drank a lot, or Bela Lugosi was addicted to morphine. And while these were a part of the story, it was again that subtle nuance of humanity that even someone who's brilliant is, well, more often than not, someone who's brilliant has a dependency, has something to quiet all the noise in their head.
Well, and also there's just something about it for, everyone in this room has been involved with filmmaking to some degree or other. And I think we've all experienced that kind of person that's like, is there a script? Fuck no, but there's a poster. Like, I love that line so much. And I love that moment of, okay, shoot it in 4 days, whatever baloney you want, just go. And I love, I think everyone in this room has shot somewhere without a permit at least once.
No, I am always legit and legal every time I've filmed.
You can't see her crossing her fingers.
I don't know what you're talking about. It's very relatable. I'm always on the up and up when it comes to that stuff.
Always, yeah.
And don't look at YouTube and find contradictory evidence to the contrary.
Please leave those in the comments.
Oh, I'm sure they've got plenty to say when we put this on Twitter.
Anyone who can find my very early films, thank you. I think they've been taken off Mr. Skin by now. Okay, they were never on Mr. Skin. No.
Well, there goes your political career.
Well, and the thing is, it's like what you're saying as far as the subtle hints, as far as Ed Wood's alcoholism and the drug addiction, it's like that's one of the things that it doesn't sensationalize that, and that is one of the great things about what Karaszewski and Alexander and Burton do, is that it would have been very easy to sensationalize, especially Bela Lugosi's drug addiction, and it really makes him sympathetic because of the fact, and then even on a different level, you can feel like you're talking about with the framed picture of Dracula overhead. That's just another thing. It's just sort of another step on him sort of not being able to get out from the shadow of his past, and sort of that's another way of his coping mechanism, unhealthy coping with that.
And I think for all creative people, this movie shows your two worst fears, either being a has-been or being a never was.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a certain way that we relate to and root for these guys because we see our fears laid bare right in front of us.
Yeah, and I have to imagine this is probably one of a lot of filmmakers' favorite films.
Oh, yeah.
When it comes to making movies, especially if you've started with that scrounging for finances and just making something for the sake of making something.
Well, I know from podcast interviews I've heard, I know Jonah Ray, who's on MS23K now.
Yeah,
he's a huge fan. Bobcat Goldthwait is a huge fan, even has a tattoo. There's a certain sense of not just fans of the Tim Burton film, but fans of Ed Wood in general. And if you look especially at Bobcat's films, that spirit definitely comes through.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, to relate it to memes for everyone that's under the age of 30, Ed Wood, the biopic, is almost like the definitive expectation versus reality.
Yeah,
You see both his expectation idea that this is going to be the greatest film ever made, the reality that it's not that bad, but it's not as pretty as you want it to be, sweetie.
Yeah.
And I love that, we're still talking about these films today, and we still know his name.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually counts for a lot. Because, how many people, aside from, real hardcore film snobs, know the name Merchant Ivory today?
Yeah.
But you only know that because we heard it last night.
I've seen one or two of his films, but yeah. That's why I thought
there
of it,
were films. There were a pair or a couple.
Yeah, I think I've seen. Yeah. I think I may have seen all of them. I think I've seen the two. But yeah, like and I don't really remember them.
And
Yeah.
They were
Roger
good,
Corman isn't an everyday name, but I can guarantee you that if you say Ed Wood at most people, even those people that don't obsessively watch movies, that they're going to go, well, I've heard that name before. But if I say Roger Corman, they're going to look at me and go,
But at the same time, if you mention Little Shop of Horrors,
then they'll know. But
they'll know who that is, and like.
But they're not going to know the original Little Shop of Horrors.
No, they're going to know the Frank Oz musical.
Yeah.
So
which is delightful.
yeah.
And not taking anything away from that. And I feel like, in a way, Jim Henson and Frank Oz had that same kind of spirit, although they had more to work with.
Yeah.
There's a certain anarchy to the Muppets that I love.
We saw that animation the other day that was clearly for an adult audience.
Oh, yeah.
That was out of Henson Studios. We found it on was it Fandor?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Also, Fandor, if you ever hear this cast, we would take a free subscription, absolutely, for advertising. But that entrepreneurial spirit is definitely visible in anything Henson, and it makes me feel almost a little Ed Wood-like there. Like they, kind of just said, we're going to throw these ideas together and make something beautiful.
Yeah.
And actually, even the first Muppet movie has a certain sense of that, where I love when Kermit's talking to his nephew and it's like, is this really the real story? Well, not exactly. I love that they're presenting this as a film within a film, and I love that there's a certain like, okay, this is close, but it's a fiction still.
Yeah.
Well, I've always decided that my biography, when I die, which may be never, that I want my story to be told as fictitiously exaggerated as possible. I was 16 feet tall and I earned a herd of oxen. Like, I want my story to be told with the barest of actual truth. I want to be a legend. And I feel like speaking of Ed Wood specifically, that there is a little bit of that beautiful fantasy weaved in. That while we looked at his warts and all, we kind of glossed over him with putting a little tiny bit of petroleum jelly on the lens.
Yeah.
There's the inspirational music helps. Like, I love Howard Shore's score is fantastic.
Oh,
and it's my favorite score he's done too.
And the theremin.
I love the theremin, and I love the sort of the marching music while they're shooting Plan 9.
Yeah.
But there is certainly a sense of fantasy to it. And like, we know Plan 9 never played at Pantages, but who cares? It's a beautiful scene.
Oh yeah.
Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, and that's one of those things where it's like you even though it's like in your mind that obviously that would not have happened, but you go with it because emotionally speaking, it's like you want that to be the case. It's wish fulfillment for these filmmakers who never really will have gotten there.
It's more honest than saying based on a true story.
Yeah,
it's far more honest.
And that's another thing. Like, so many movies now are based on a true story, but they've got like 2 or 3 things that actually happen, and the rest is completely made up.
Let me get on my soapbox real quick on a movie that's totally unrelated. I love horror. Horror is my jam. I am obsessed. And one of my favorite films is The Strangers. I love The Strangers. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, right off a highway, where terrible things could happen.
Right.
Because, it was pitch black. Even 911 had to get directions to our house. That's how bad we were at the time. But it says based on a true story.
Yeah.
The actual story is, ready guys? I'm about to load some truth on you. The actual story is, in the middle of the night, someone came to the director's door as he was a child and asked if someone who didn't live there was home.
So by that logic, you could claim that Lost Highway is based on a true story, because somebody rang David Lynch's door and said Dick Laurent is dead and ran away. So, by that same logic, you could claim that anything is true.
Yeah.
Whereas with Ed Wood, yes, there is a gloss of fantasy. There are some things that are definitely not true, of made for more interesting story. But there's so much that actually was true that is somewhat legendary. Like, making a film with one of your favorite actors is true. Getting that opportunity.
Well, and most of the stuff that's not 100% true in that film is just kind of window dressing. A lot of it is, we didn't know how these two people really met, so here's an introduction.
Yeah.
And, it does kind of gloss over things for
I'm going
time.
to hold that to canon. I'm going to just say
Well, yeah, so
that story's canon.
they totally met at the Brown Derby. Sure,
Yes,
why not?
Yes, that happened.
And so there's a lot of little things around, sort of they color in the lines a little bit.
What's that line about? I choose to ignore your reality and create my own.
Yeah.
That's how I live my life.
Exactly, yeah. And so there's definitely, a sense that there's, if you really wanted to go line by line, there's, dozens of things that are not true. But the amount of things that are perfect is astounding.
So I think this is a good segue to kind of dip into Glenn or Glenda again.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely true and not true.
Yeah.
And I, by the way, I found it funny. When we were doing research, we found out that the Roku still lists it as "I changed my sex," and we just thought it was amusing. So I wanted to throw it out there for anyone.
That's why things were said in tandem. It makes it more interesting if you say it at the same time.
Yeah, a lot of rappers have noticed that too. Like,
okay, let's let Brian talk. It's his show.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. Yeah. Well, and one of the things that when we first started talking about Ed Wood, and we were talking about things like Bela Lugosi's drug addiction, stuff like that, I think, and segueing into Glenn or Glenda by way of Tim Burton's film, I think one of the things that's most impactful to me is, especially since I was like 17, 18 when I first saw it, was the idea that Ed Wood is a transvestite, and that's most everybody in the film is completely accepting of that and completely understanding of that,
except for Horseface. Horseface can't take that he's prettier as a girl.
Except now, when I think of Horseface, unfortunately, I have a different image in my head.
So you've seen
because
Zoo.
Never mind. That's a recent.
Let's not talk about Mr. Hands. No, let's not.
Yeah.
We're not getting invited back, folks.
Anyway, but and I think that was something that really I think that really had an effect on me, and not in the sense of anything, just being so accepting of that as just a completely normal thing that could be, that somebody would do.
Yeah.
I mean, we grew up in the South, so we don't necessarily hide our crazy in the attic. We put it out on the front porch for everybody to see it. But being accepting of anything to do with gender identity, especially when we're in our teens, it wasn't nearly what it's like now. So it was like Matt had with Rocky Horror Picture Show, being exposed to there's more than one type of sexuality? What?
Well, I mean, like when I saw Rocky Horror at first, I was 11, and I knew that there were people who were attracted to the same sex. I knew there were people attracted to the opposite sex. But it didn't occur to me that there's somebody that might be attracted to both. And so that blew my mind when I was 11. And, it's weird how a lot of, we tend to give pop culture a bad rap and say you can't really, these movies don't really mean anything and blah, blah, blah. But actually, there are so many times where you can get a message or a lesson or an idea from something that pays off in your real life. Even if it's just, hey, be nicer to this person because they've been through a lot that you don't know about.
And at the time, transvestism was still considered in the DSM. It was a mental defect that you could actually go be what's the word I'm looking for? Committed for.
Yeah.
So to see in this film, even though, to be fair, it's, a fictionalized depiction, we don't know what it was really like, but to see it be so accepted is a beautiful thing. And I wonder if the reality was more not necessarily acceptance, but more that's just Ed, guys. That's how he rolls.
Do you imagine there's like 3 grips going, oh, do you want to say anything? No.
Have you tried to touch the sweater before, guy? Don't do it.
Oh, and that's one thing I love about Johnny Depp's performance. Thank you for reminding me. I love how there's all sorts of points where he's putting his hand on a woman's shoulder in a way that's meant to look like he's comforting, but he's just really feeling the fabric.
Yeah.
Like, there's so many little nuances in that performance that astound me.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't see Glenn or Glenda till I was much older. I had seen Plan 9 much earlier. But being a somewhat gay teenager and seeing a representation of something like this was... it was like knowing about David Bowie to me. It was that there are people like me in the world,
right?
And they can be famous and they can do things.
They can be beloved for being different.
Yes, and that was like when Bowie died. It was like losing a parent. It ruined me for a few days, and because that's how much my parents are valuable. It's a few day upset for me, but seeing any kind of gender dysphoria, any representation of anything that's even outside of the norm was impressive to me. And as you're saying, Brian, and I know you grew up in a bit more conservative household too. So,
well, I mean, or at least I wasn't necessarily as exposed to. I wouldn't say necessarily more conservative. I mean, I was certainly not as, that type of thing wasn't discussed.
I went to naked witch gatherings on the weekend. I think your household was probably more conservative.
Well, yeah.
Did they know you were going to that, though? Did they know?
My dad didn't, but my mom did.
Okay, so you get half credit for that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's something about that's so ahead of the curve, and I think it's so interesting that Ed was willing to put something that private out there. And I think it's fascinating that he was that open, like, okay, I'm going to tell everybody.
Yeah.
And because of him not being fantastic with dialogue, it was very obvious how personal this story was. In fact, it highlights that he is a good filmmaker in the sense that he put his personal narrative out there, warts and all, yet again, to use the phrase, for everyone to see, and it was clear it was personal, and while the film was not necessarily loved, it was definitely a passion project.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I love about him as a filmmaker, especially that film. I mean, as filmmaking, it's kind of a train wreck in a lot of ways. But at the same time, it's something that you can't help but watch it and admire it to a certain degree.
A little love.
Yeah.
Like, you start to love Mr. Wood just a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, and according to what I read, 14 minutes of that are stock footage. Like, there's a huge amount of that he didn't make himself.
Yeah.
And it's, but it's also kind of fitting because it is this mishmash of things. And what is that Polnick line again?
My favorite line from Invisible Monsters, which is, "Nothing of me is original. I am the combined effort of every person I've ever known."
And I think that that's true of filmmakers in general. We all kind of have mashups, and I love people that are willing to kind of throw things together, and like that's one of the reasons that the Coen brothers are so celebrated is they can't do a straight film. They're like, even a neo-noir film has kind of horror elements, or they mix stuff around so much that
Greg Araki did a straight film.
He did one straight film. But the only, like, there's also, even among some of our underground heroes, there's still a sense of cynicism to them. Like, I'm very fond of Herschel Gordon Lewis, and his movies are awful, but I love the salesmanship. Like, he was one of those guys that knew how to sell a movie, and I love the idea that he knew how to show you something that nobody else had.
Right.
And so I prefer, given the choice, I prefer something a little more personal. But I also appreciate that whole idea of, here's something that nobody else is going to show you, and everybody line up because I've got it and no one else does, and you're gonna love it. And that kind of sensationalism that William Castle had, like that man knew how to advertise.
Now, on the other end of the spectrum is my personal favorite director, Mr. Charles Band from Full Moon, who was like, "Will this sell? Oh, it's tiny things that'll kill. That'll sell. Let's make it."
Hey, we made one of those last year. Well, it made money, didn't it? Let's make another.
And yet, I introduced Matt. I don't know if you're familiar, Ryan, with Video Zone from Full Moon.
No.
So in the 90s, so I feel like I need to translate this for younger listeners.
Okay.
In the 90s, there were these things called videotapes.
Oh, come on. They know what they are. They collect them.
Oh, yeah, they're so retro. So there were these videotapes, but Full Moon would put, and since they couldn't really get trailers for any movies other than Full Moon movies,
right,
they put in about a half-hour segment talking about the films that they were making, including behind-the-scenes stuff, interviews with the actors. And it was just
stuff.
And they would teach you about effects. They would talk about merch they were selling. It was this real, and it actually, seeing those as a kid made me think that Mr. Band might be a little more involved because he wanted to teach us about filmmaking in the process. And I think that's where my spirit to make films kind of came from, is because these were gems. They were on Bad Movies.
Yeah.
And you can see some of them if you, on the Full Moon streaming channel, they have some of the video zones pulled up, which are great because each one ends with like a phone number and an address you can call, and they've blocked them out because they're like, this is 2000, we don't have these anymore.
Use the internet. Yeah.
I think that was actually the exact phrase they said, was they covered up the address and said, use the internet.
And and Lloyd Kaufman has that same kind of personal thing where he's written so many books about low budget filmmaking, and he's done so many videos just on YouTube. And
like, we can joke that they're all in it for the money, but they're clearly in love with their professions.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and that's I think that's the case. We talked about Lynch last time, we're talking about Ed Wood this time. It's like, that's part of why when I decided that like Ed Wood was gonna be part of these bookends for me as far as filmmakers, that's part of why I didn't feel like that was out of place. Yeah, the quality of his work is definitely out of step with somebody like Kurosawa and Bergman, but the spirit and the auteur spirit is not. It's very much like, you're watching. You're watching an Ed Wood film.
Yeah, you're watching his brain spilled out in front of you.
I mean, I think a lot of the great filmmakers are like that. They have certain signatures, And now with Ed Wood, that's a little bit more complicated because it's like, well, his signature's kind of bad, but at the same time, it's a particular type of bad too.
But his signature is, honestly, I prefer Ed Wood's signature to, say, Wes Anderson's signatures. Wes Anderson's signature is like the syncopated talking, drive me batty. The fact that everyone speaks on the same meter drives me insane. Whereas Ed Wood's movies being a little bit bad, but everyone kind of, the dialogue being kind of measured, but you can tell that people are ad-libbing a little here and there. You can tell that there's a lot of openness for creativity in the set.
Yeah.
That's a signature I appreciate. I appreciate when I know that if it were anyone but Ed Wood, there would be thousands of blooper reels of people breaking while doing the show.
And instead, he just puts them in the finished movie.
Yes, he does.
I do love that, and I love, and I'm from a particular period where the first horror movies that really resonated with me were the Universal monster movies, and I loved the Castles and the Fog and the whole thing, and I love detective stories and things like that. So there's so much of the aesthetic he's drawing from are things that I love.
You guys are so classy compared to me. Like, my favorite horror movie is, Cannibal Holocaust.
Which is a classic, too.
And the scariest movie I've ever seen is Jesus Camp.
Okay, I think we can all agree on that one.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Not to put you on the spot,
just
but
a little bit. No, I mean it's certainly scary in a lot of ways. Um, but yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things that I like about Ed Wood is that I mean I do feel like I'm getting you still feel like you're getting a complete experience with his movies, and it's so entertaining and like yeah it's I don't necessarily I've started to sort of repel from the idea of oh it's so bad it's good.
yeah,
It's like it's either good or it's bad. Let's be perfectly frank here.
yeah.
But that just because it's bad doesn't mean there isn't anything that can be entertaining about it.
We have a phrase in our household that it's not a good movie, but it's fun.
Yeah.
That is something we have is like the first question is, well, is it good? No. Is it fun? Yes, it is absolutely fun. Like one of my favorite movies is Night of the Demons. That is not a good movie in any stretch. Though the Susie and the Banshees, if you've ever seen the film, the dance is, I would highly recommend.
Wasn't that Bauhaus, or am I remembering
It
wrong?
might have been Bauhaus. I don't know. It's one. They didn't get the rights for the song either way, so it doesn't really matter. But there is this fabulous scene in it with a what's the word? Strobe light and a dance. The movie is terrible, though. It is not a good film.
Yeah.
It spawned sequels that were actually better. But it's fun. And that's the way and the thing I feel about Ed Wood, specifically his films, is they are definitely fun and they are personal. I can watch, say The Witch. Let's talk about a modern horror film that's absolutely stunningly beautiful, that is really well made, that's a great story. But I don't feel like that director gave me anything of themselves. There is nothing personal in that film. Whereas I watch Plan 9, and I can feel like Ed Wood is trying to tell me something about him.
Yeah.
And that's the connection I have with these movies, with any really low-budget filmmaker, is that they had to work to make this thing. And when you work, when you put your heart in it, it's obvious.
Well, to use something a little more modern, if you look at something like Night of the Creeps or The Monster Squad, you can see Fred Decker going like, these are things that I loved, let's put them together and hope someone likes it.
Yeah.
And throw them together and mix them around. And
I highly do not recommend watching Monster Squad as an adult.
It doesn't hold up quite as well, but it's...
I actually really liked it. I think it was the first time I had seen it last year, and I actually enjoyed it still.
I think watching it as a kid and then seeing it as an adult changes it a little bit. If you see it the first time as an adult, then it's like, oh, well, this is good. But seeing it as a kid, I thought it was much more of a monster movie than it is. And it's a little more, it's got a lot more coming of age and awkwardness to it than I remember being there. And as an adult, that became cringeworthy for me. Like, oh God, I was watching, I didn't understand any of this.
But at the same time, like to the point we were making is it's definitely a portrait of who Fred Decker was and what he loved growing up, and Shane Black as well, because I know they worked on it together. I feel the same
way about John Landis and Joe Dante.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That they put their heart in their films. They just have a better budget.
or like with the Blues Brothers, they just disregard the budget and keep spending anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, like
that's how I feel on Amazon. I just disregard my budget and just keep buying.
But yeah, there's definitely, and I think one of the reasons that Ed's movies didn't quite click at the time is because we're more open to that now. I think it's a cultural thing. Like back then, horror movies were for the drive-in or they were Saturday matinee, and it was just
and
like
you didn't pay attention to most of it.
Yeah, it was just let's throw it up and hope the kids like it and whatever else, And so the idea that this is a genre that could be used for serious self-expression or just here's a bunch of stuff I like, don't you enjoy it, is kind of is still a fairly new idea.
Well, and that sort of brings me to, because the thing is, it's like, and that's interesting because of the fact that it makes me wonder. I'm curious how both of you feel about this. Is the reason audiences weren't necessarily receptive to Plan 9 and stuff like that solely because of the fact that it's like they weren't, if we basically, I guess what I'm trying to get at is if we didn't know what we know now, if like audiences then knew what they knew, what we know about Ed Wood then, I know what I'm trying to say. It's just not.
Well, let's paraphrase Beetlejuice. If I knew then what I know now,
I would
Yeah.
have had
my
my
little
little
accident.
accident. Yeah.
So basically what I'm trying to get at is if audiences in the 50s had been as clued into who Ed Wood was as an individual as we are watching it in retrospect with the Tim Burton film and all of that stuff, do you think they will have been more receptive to that? His films?
think honestly probably no, because the culture at the time just
Yeah.
wasn't ready for it. Like there was
Yeah.
he would
They're-
just be a queer.
they're
I
not
Yeah.
they're not ready for that kind of, but they're also not ready for that level of artistic honesty, that
Mhm.
sense of this is something I really care about.
And they
And
probably
there's-
wouldn't have been, and they probably wouldn't have necessarily thought about
Well,
genre and the terms
Right, and
of
the whole idea
being
that
honest.
science fiction or fantasy
in
or
it.
things like that are horror, that they're the idea that we have that they're really honorable things
Yeah.
is kind of new.
Let me parallel Ed Wood's movies with a recent film that all three of us like, which is Hereditary.
Mm-hmm.
Ari Aster put so much of his self into that film. You can palpably feel
Yeah.
that he understands the nuance of a dysfunctional family, and it's this. And give
Mm-hmm.
if you strip away the badness of Ed Wood's films, you get that same palpable
Yeah.
sense of he understands his subject,
Mhm.
and he.
The thing also that makes that an interesting example is I was just yesterday listening to his interview with Mick Garris, and he said that he started out making Hereditary in a very cynical way. He said, well, I know horror films sell, so I'm going to write a horror movie. And then as he was making it, he started thinking, well, what can I add to it that I care about? What can I do to make myself excited
Right.
about making a horror film? And so I like that it started off as, in a cynical kind of way, and then became passionate as it went
Mhm.
along. And
Yeah.
I think that the passion he brought to it really shows.
Yeah, and as somebody who, and I mean, I didn't even necessarily think, and it's funny, I just watched Hereditary again this morning, on the day of this record, and it's interesting that it's like I had actually, it didn't even, when after I'd seen Hereditary, I went back and as I was writing my review and read up on what else Ari Aster made, and it's like it didn't even occur to me that just I had actually seen one of his short films like years ago and reviewed it, and it's like it was another story of dysfunctional family. It's a very different story of dysfunctional family. It's not horror; it's dark comedy. But it's the same type of thing, and it's completely bonkers and brilliant. And it's like that's one of the things. So yeah, I mean, and I think, and you're right as far as genre. Just now, sort of being a little bit more accepted as you can do something more personal in there.
And I think that like some of the classics, Day of the Earth Stood Still and stuff helped because it had a message, and I think the popularity of Star Trek had something to do with that. And I think the idea of films like Star Wars, which aren't really as message heavy, still becoming popular is what helped ease it.
Well,
so I don't think like at the time it would have been accepted, but I think it had to go through this metamorphosis.
We had to get comfortable with the idea of a generic message before we could get comfortable with the idea of a personal one, because it's let's take the theory of the public and the personal sphere. The public sphere is much more open and broad than the personal sphere is. So it makes absolute sense psychologically that we could open up first to the public sphere of a message that's not directed at anyone or from anyone. Then we can open up to the idea of the artist actually presenting a personal message.
Because remember, the auteur theory didn't come about till the 60s.
I was just about to bring that up too, because of now.
so
I mean,
smart.
that's not to say that Truffaut or Godard would have necessarily put Ed Wood in the same context that they do Orson Welles or Hitchcock, but I mean, certainly, and you're absolutely right, because of the fact that we didn't have the idea of the auteur theory, the director as author of a film. It was still very much considered by committee, even if you knew particular filmmakers' names like Hitchcock, like Capra, like Wells.
Let's point out that directors weren't particularly important really until Hitchcock.
Yeah.
That wasn't an idea that people took that, oh, this is a film directed by.
Yeah.
It starred blank.
And occasionally new producers. Like, quick, off the top of your head, name the director of any Val Lewton movie.
Jacques Tourneur. Well, okay. And I've watched most of them, so it's like I've watched and reviewed most of them.
Okay, let's get a lay person in here. We got to pause the cast 1 second.
Okay, so you're a bad example for this, but
3 days later,
even among most film fans, they know Val Lewton's movies, but they know
more for the producer than the director.
Right? Yeah, he is the name you put on the DVD sets,
right?
Because he's the name that you can sell,
right? And the fact of the matter is, he was ultimately the real author of those films. I mean, you have filmmakers like Val Lewton and Mark Robinson and Robert Wise who worked on those, but ultimately they were at the service of Val Lewton's vision.
And I need to correct my statement. In America, this was a new concept of directors.
Right.
European directors, totally a thing, have always been a thing since movies came to Europe.
Yeah.
I mean,
and even the first directors who were stars like Chaplin and Keaton and all that, they were stars because they starred in the movies, not because they directed them.
Right.
And even though like their vision is very clearly seen, we didn't think of it in those terms.
No, and the thing is, it's like especially in the early days, it's like you weren't necessarily thinking of filmmaking as anything more than just entertainment. It was solely for entertainment. You weren't necessarily looking at a larger personal expression,
right?
And that didn't even really come through until years later.
Well, I mean, and there's so much of that was, especially at first, was come inside, we have air conditioning and snacks, and just be entertained for a little while.
Which is also Matt's way he's got me to date him. Come inside, I have air conditioning and snacks. There was a van involved.
No, there wasn't.
He couldn't afford a van.
Nope.
But this concept of the cast, or rather the crew, being important, so include the director, of this being a vision as opposed to an experience,
right,
is relatively new, and it's even new nowadays because you still you see people who are younger than us who are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how personal this was. Whereas they, talking about like Orange is the New Black, which is based off of, a biography in essence. Not realizing that personal ideas have been in every film they've seen that's gotten popular in the last 20 years. But we were raised on, Back to the Future and things that didn't really have that personal narrative until we delved into it.
Yeah.
You had to be a nerd to care about the director's vision.
Yeah.
And sometimes, I remember, I think it was Fred Decker, I think he said that Robert Zemeckis is a magician, and sometimes he makes a whole movie just because he wants to do one trick. But that's still a valid way of doing things. Like, this is something that I love and I want to put it out there.
This podcast is sponsored by Fred Decker School of Magic.
Apparently he was a magician as a kid, by the way. I thought you'd want to know. But yeah, see, this is the shit that just comes out of me. Bailey was not kidding.
Just don't get him started on Song of the South.
Yeah,
you don't have that kind of time.
That's another podcast for another
day,
another show.
It was the first time I'd ever actually ignored Matthew while he was talking. We're in a bookstore, and I finally just kind of sit down, and I pick up a book, and I just kind of, yeah, that's a good idea. I kindergarten teachered the whole thing. Like, you're so smart.
Like, you put up the newspaper in front of you. Yep, I'm watching. I promise. Yeah.
But I do love that this is a concept that we now have as filmmakers, as idealistic filmmakers, as prospective filmmakers,
Yeah.
that we can take our heart, kind of rip it out, cut a little part of it, and put it in that film.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the spice that makes our film interesting.
Well, and Hitchcock is a great example because so much of the things were based off things that were personal to him, like the fear of authority figures, and
Yeah.
the fear of being innocent but blamed for something.
NWA was quoting Hitchcock when they made their major hit.
Oh yeah, probably paraphrasing, I imagine, but yeah, but that's still taking these silly broad adventure movies and putting something personal into it to kind of ground it.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of love how even something like North by Northwest, which is just big Technicolor fun, still has that idea of menace underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
But shall we jump into Bride of the Monster for a moment?
We can.
Where do you want to run from here?
You tell us what to do, Brian.
I'm trying to figure out where to go from there. We can touch a little bit on Bride of the Monster. Admittedly, it's been a little bit since I've watched it.
Well, so much of the really interesting stuff is covered in the biopic. So
yeah.
But it's my favorite of Ed Wood's films,
Mm-hmm.
and it's arguably the best one, like the one that's most coherent, aside from maybe Night of the Ghouls.
Yeah.
I think Night of the Ghouls is now my favorite now that I've seen it. I really, really enjoyed it.
But I love how I love that there's
Thank you,
that Paul Marco's character is in each of these movies,
Mm-hmm.
and I love that there's this recurring plot, and I love that he made a sequel. Yeah, like that was destroyed by lightning. Yeah, the old Willow's place. Yeah. But I kind of love that these movies show that he had something. Like given the right kind of encouragement, he maybe could have nourished it into something really wonderful,
Mm-hmm.
or something just more coherent. But
well, it makes me think of John Waters. Like John Waters' early films.
full of passion, full of
I can't
ideas.
believe we've paid money for, because they are just abysmal. Like, this is one of the few instances where I'm like, pirating could be okay. But John Waters, when giving a little bit of nurturing and given a budget, makes some really personal, interesting, out there film, and I wonder if that could have been the same trajectory that Ed Wood could have had.
The difference between Desperate Living and Polyester is huge, and that was just a couple of years.
And let's mention my absolute favorite, Cecil B. Demented. That is a film that actually mainstream people like not just super nerds.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I love, and also like something like Hairspray or Crybaby, I kind of love the idea that same sense of humor and that same sense of the dark and the weirdness is still there, but it's palatable and loved by teenagers. And, I love that these things translate.
I'm just thinking of our niece.
Oh, goodness gracious.
Oh, yeah. we have a niece that's, well, you know how we talk about movies earlier that's not good, but it's fun?
Mm-hmm.
She's not bright, but she's not stupid.
She exists in a strange netherworld.
And so when we were talking about John Waters movies to her, she was like, "Oh, I've seen Hairspray." I'm like, "Well, did you see the one with John Travolta? Or did you see the one with Harvey Pierce? It wasn't Harvey
With
Pierce.
Divine, yeah.
With Divine." And she goes, "Saw a movie." Like, just completely baffled her that there were actually two versions of this movie. But I think that Bride of the Monster, if somebody had given it a little time to sculpt it out, just
a little more money,
just a
maybe,
little more money, a little more
restoration.
time, that it could have been an absolutely wonderful movie.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still good and it's fun. But
Well, and this is something I was talking about with Bailey a while back with MST3K. My favorite movies on that show are the better ones.
Yeah.
Like some of the stuff like Manos is interesting to see, and it's a fascinating kind of experience. But the show isn't really that funny because they're just kind of grappling with what the hell do I do with this?
Yeah.
But I love, like, I Accuse My Parents and This Island Earth, and
Mm-hmm.
the better the movies on that show are, the more fun it is because they're just kind of filling in the gaps.
Yeah.
And they're pointing out the zipper on the back of the monster,
Mm-hmm.
and but it's more like this is actually a pretty solid movie, and we're just gonna have a little fun with it.
Right. Yeah, and I will say it's been years since I've seen Bride of the Monster, so I can't necessarily speak on it specifically. I will say that stretch when they're filming in Ed Wood does have one of my all-time favorite lines, and I'm sure line that I quote at least once or twice on one of the films I was making, where Bela Lugosi goes, "All right, let's shoot this fucker."
One of my friends wrote that in my yearbook senior year. Yeah, like it's, and that by the way, Alexander and Karaszewski's screenplay is so quotable.
Mm-hmm.
Like every line
absolutely,
is gold. Every word of it is.
Yeah,
perfect.
I think that, and when Bunny says when they're getting baptized, it's like, I want to hear you call Boris Karloff a cocksucker.
I think we know your favorite line.
No, actually, "Let's shoot this fucker" is my favorite line
Yeah.
in the biopic, because we have all been on that set where you've waited 40 minutes for people to come in from out of town.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody decided, "I need water," and you're finally just like, "All right, let's shoot this fucker. Come on, we can do this."
Now, one side note that might be interesting: Bride of the Monster was Ed's only financially successful film. One of the producers
it
is
made
named
$7.
Samuel K. Arkoff, and he used that to found American International Pictures.
Okay.
And so all those Corman movies are in some way to thank you.
Wow.
You have Bride of the Monster to thank for the Poe cycle, and
we brought up Corman on more than one occasion
So
this
behind
time.
every Corman, there's an Ed Wood in a dress.
Well, probably in a dress, maybe just
just
the undergarments. Maybe
I'm actually gonna just think that he's in the little dance outfit.
Oh yeah.
Just kind of inspiring, maybe posing.
And I love I love knowing that this one filmmaker who spawned the career of every major director who's alive now basically got a start because of Ed Wood. Yeah. Like, I love that sometimes things really do run on time. And I'm fascinated.
That's not true. There are no things that run on time, Matthew. Not in the entertainment industry.
Oh, yeah, that's probably true. But I do love that, without that, like we wouldn't have Scorsese or Ron Howard or anybody else. In some weird way, Ed is kind of the patron saint of all of these. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things where it's like, that's why he's, I mean, even with, I didn't know that about Bride of the Monster spawning American International. And then, I know American International produced Corman and stuff like that. I mean, I just rewatched Mask of the Red Death, which was from that era.
Well, and I love how these things connect, because apparently part of what drew Tim Burton to the script was the friendship between Ed and Bella reminded him of his friendship with Vincent Price. Yeah. So there's a certain where it kind of loops back on itself. And
sorry, you got me a little verklempt.
Yeah, and obviously, Vincent Price was in a much better place in his career and his life. But, he had just died the year before. And they had done a series of in-depth interviews for a documentary that's not going to ever be finished. And, and there's this really personal attachment there. And I believe that's why they sent him the script in the first place. I'm pretty sure the idea was, like, I think he'll appreciate this. If we make him cry,
he'll do it?
Maybe. And I don't know if you knew about this too also, but Elliot Gould of Simpsons fame, he became friends with Mela Nurmi, or Vampira, later in her life, and was kind of a caretaker towards her. Okay. So it's one of these things where these things cycle in a way. Like one person...
I just realized how we're going to get to make a film. We need to find a dying celebrity.
We need to find our own Harold Zoid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Come fund my movie with your rich doctor money. Yeah. But yeah.
As everything in our life it comes back around to Futurama.
Yeah. Futurama or Twin Peaks quotes come up just daily, and it's just the way it is.
Actually, no. But it's beautiful how those kind of things come together, how it all kinds of cycles together. That Ed Wood could be considered the nutty grandmother of our modern genre films.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how, to get sort of a thing that feeds off your earlier question, how acceptable genre films are now.
Yeah.
Like the fact that last year's Oscar winner was a monster movie,
Mm-hmm.
and the best original screenplay was, while it was a obviously a pointed racial critique, in the end it was kind
It's
of a
also
goofy
a genre
sci-fi
film.
movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's Creature from the Black Lagoon meets B movie,
Yeah.
Well, and I love
and less creepy.
yeah, and I love that these things which we used to sort of hide and forget about and put under the closet
Mm-hmm.
are now gaining some level of respectability.
Yeah.
And one of the highest grossing films of last year was It, which I know is technically a remake, but it was still a really solid horror movie.
Yeah.
With really great performances, especially from kids.
It is the
Yeah.
golden age of my genre.
Yeah, and it's kind of marvelous because I
Mhm.
love the idea that these filmmakers are getting a shot with some actual money and
Yeah.
a chance to connect with audiences.
So, Brian, when are we going to do our Doug Jones podcast? Because that needs to happen.
Mm.
Oh, that would be fun, wouldn't
That
it?
would be.
Oh, getting to watch so many Doug Jones movies. Oh, my God. I will watch The Shape of Water twice a week for you. I can do that.
So how in depth do we want to go? Do we want to find the Mac Tonight commercials and Hocus Pocus, or do you want to just stick with modern stuff?
I'm actually thinking I should show Brian that Wendigo episode of Fear Itself that Doug Jones shows as himself for a while. I showed you that.
Yeah, yeah.
Doug Jones actually does not have makeup on for
Yeah.
a part of the episode. It's,
Oh, wow.
it's but do you know the Legend of the Wendigo?
No.
Basically, if you say accidentally eat one of your fellow humans, that a spirit comes into you and makes you bad. You're corrupted by the corrupted flesh.
Mhm.
So it actually, the portrayal in this has Doug Jones kind of slowly decaying and becoming this monster. And so it's a subtle transformation for him, but it's absolutely inspired. It's beautiful, and it's one of the few good episodes of Fear Itself. There's a reason Fear Itself didn't have a second season.
Which is a shame because there's a lot of passion in that series too.
Yeah, and I mean this is what I do in my spare time is I watch less beloved horror things to try to find the prettiness, the joy in them, the passion, and that's part of the reason I love Ed Wood so much. Why I love Tim Burton, because Tim Burton's become on that less beloved genre. These directors that take their heart and put it, and their heart's a little black and a little crusty, but they take it and put it into a film and tell us a story that's unique to them but is relatable to everyone.
Yeah.
Well, and I love, I'm always on the lookout for something unique and strange. I remember we've all worked at a movie theater at one point or
Add your
another.
strange pics to the comments.
And one time, A Dangerous Method was out for like a week, the Cronenberg film, and I was one of my coworkers got to see it, and I didn't get the chance, and so I was asking her, how was it? She's like, that was weird. Like, weird how? She's like, I don't know, just weird.
Didn't we just watch that?
No, we watched Hysteria, which
Oh,
wasn't very
okay.
good.
No.
Yeah, but it was one of those things where like I was trying to explain, like I told her a little bit about like Videodrome, and I'm like, so weird like a vaginal opening with a videotape, or weird just like weird how? She's like, I don't know, just weird. I'm like, like, so the idea that you tell me there's something strange out there I haven't seen, I'm interested.
Yeah.
And just one final note on movies and strangeness. These strange movies are definitive for some of us, especially me. I grew up extremely awkward, always interested in weird things, and seeing these things brought to film, such as Cronenberg's vaginal tummy videotape holder, seeing that someone else had weird ideas and could make them into something that could be relatable to not just the awkward people, but to everyone. is part of the reason I love film as a genre. I love that we have this way to express our deepest, darkest fears to where the world can understand why we are the way we are.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm also a big fan of Joe Bob Briggs, and I love his articles and when he used to host Monster Vision and stuff like that. I love the idea that he can take something that isn't great and find the good in it and say, okay, well, most of this movie is kind of trash, but there's like 3 great scenes you have to see.
Yeah.
Or at the same time, he can take something that's really good but a little goofy and still make fun of the goofy parts and still find the joy in the rest of it. Monster Vision was a big part of why I became a horror fan, because in these in-between segments before the commercials, we would get little tidbits that told me about other films I need to find. And instead of just like, okay, this guy made this one movie, okay, I learned about something else he did, and then the story behind that, and it just sort of blossomed into this really intriguing thing.
Yeah.
And he became the human encyclopedia of film that he is today.
For better or for worse.
Now, ask me about any bad horror film from the 70s to the 90s, and I can give you a list of every detail there is to be about it. But Matt has got a little less specialty.
Well, I'm special. My specialization is in different decades than yours. But yeah.
Just like a lot of blood and carnage.
Oh, and tits. Don't forget tits.
Oh, I do like tits.
The thing that can make a film successful.
The thing that made the kindergarten teacher interesting. Yeah. Yes, that's what we said. There are tits in a movie called The Kindergarten Teacher. Go check it out on Netflix.
That is a really awkward movie. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Have you seen it?
I've not seen it.
Oh, I would not and recommend.
It's if you know you're in for an awkward time, it's pretty well made, but it's hard to sit through.
Yeah.
Well, and it's another case of I'm pretty sure there is a personal vision in this film, that there is a story deeper than the story we're being told.
Yeah.
But it is remarkably uncomfortable. It is as uncomfortable as the head scene in Hereditary. Uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But it's for an hour and a half of
but
that.
it's imagine that sort of discomfort spread out over
Just
the whole
over and out. And it's a short film comparatively to what we're putting out lately. But to bring it back to our main focus, it is a personal story. It is definitely a film that is trying to tell us something very important without spelling the message out necessarily.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing, is that all art is kind of an open circuit, and you need the audience to complete it. And everybody's going to take something different from it, and that might not necessarily...
Unless you're Darren Aronofsky. He does not need us.
No. Like, there are a couple of people that tell you exactly what they want you to get out of it, but for the most part, we talked about this with David Lynch. I love the idea that, it's open to interpretation, and the film needs the audience in order to be complete. It needs our interpretation.
Sorry, there's a lizard.
There's a lizard on the window, and Bailey is transfixed.
There's a lizard in every one of our hearts. There is.
I just imagine a listener going, what kind of Mickey Mouse bullshit is this?
I am a cat, guys. I have a human shape, but I am a cat. If there was a red dot in here, I wouldn't have talked this whole thing. But to thank you, Brian, for inviting us to come in.
No problem.
I'm so happy we got to talk about film and personal expression. Yeah. And it's something we need to, people dismiss people who love pop culture. Yeah. They dismiss us as not having our own opinions. But as I saw recently in a post about millennials, which I hate the term. Yeah. But we have not been given these clear definitions of who we are as other. We don't have the same points, like getting married, getting a house, having kids. We don't have those. So where we find our meaning is piecemeal as we can. Pop culture and film and music and things that we experience teach us who we are as people now. And Ed Wood was very definitively one of those people. He taught us who he was and his landmarks through his films.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and Tim Burton is obviously the same way. I remember reading that he felt very close to Ed Wood because a lot of the shooting locations were around Burbank, California, where he grew up.
Mm-hmm.
So he recognized the cemetery. He recognized Griffith Park.
Yeah.
He recognized these places, and this felt like home.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 had a similar effect to me because most horror films are set in a small town because it's relatable.
Mm-hmm.
But with this one, like, that town's just like an hour away from where we are right now. And I recognized some of the styles of house and some of the shape of the trees.
Yeah.
And like, wow, this is home. Okay. You know, and it relates on a deeper level than just like something that's, British Columbia dressed to look like New York.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I definitely had that type of experience around this time last year when I finally watched the Errol Morris documentary Vernon, Florida for the first time. It was his second film after Gates of Heaven, and it's about this very small town, and it's basically just a town with a road through it, and just talking to the people in this town, and it reminded me of the town that I lived in up in Ohio before we moved down to Georgia, and I just had this sense of identification with these people and their lives and the way the rhythms of their lives and the way their lives went, that just really touched on me on a personal level that I didn't necessarily expect. And that's one of the things that I think great filmmakers are capable of. You know, whether they're making great art like somebody like Earl Morris or somebody who is a little bit more flawed like Tim Burton, or somebody who really doesn't has the passion but doesn't necessarily have the resources to bring it to full fruition like Ed Wood. And
I feel like almost like Ed Wood is someone speaking French living in America. He can express how he feels very clearly to himself.
Yeah.
But we might not necessarily be able to understand more than a couple words.
Well, and I don't know necessarily that everyone in his circle got it either.
Yeah.
But they clearly didn't care too much. It was just
That's it.
I love I love that sense that he built a family around himself of other misfits, and I love that he was able to gather these people together, and you know, like at the time Vampire was relatively famous and Criswell was famous, but there were other people who were on the other side of it, like Lyle Talbot when he was in, I believe, Glen or Glinda, was in a similar shape to Lugosi. Like he was getting paid in cash for like insurance purposes because they wouldn't hire him. And, like I love this notion that you're able to take people from different levels and find a bond.
Yeah. And that's that's ultimately one of the things that I think resonates most strongly with me about Ed Wood. That's one of the reasons I like so much of the different movies and TV shows and stuff that I like, is the idea that these communities of misfits that come together and create something special and have this bond that goes beyond some of the things that we typically associate with success and life and art and all of that. And that's one of the things I think is so beautiful about Ed Wood's life, and also whether you're talking about as brought to the screen by Tim Burton or by his life in general. With all that being said, I think this is a pretty good place to wrap it up. It's been a really great discussion about Ed Wood, about cinema in general, about a lot of different topics in regards that come out of that discussion of Ed Wood, and just sort of bring with him putting him more in a context as an important filmmaker in his own right, even if his films weren't necessarily as great as we typically look at important filmmakers as. With that being said, thank you very much to Matt and Bailey for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
And we'll definitely do this again. I know you and I have talked about doing Hitchcock, Matt, and that's a discussion I definitely want to do at some point.
Just narrowing
and
down the
just
film list will be hard.
yeah, I know. And just just talking. I always enjoy just talking about movies and things in regards to movies. And I mean, that's one of the things I like about this discussion that we just had, is that it covers a pretty wide swath.
Yeah,
And that's a very good word. And
it also rhymes with sloth.
that we also don't necessarily get to talk about on a regular basis if we're talking about some of the more important films or just filmmakers in general. So
I think that the borderline mediocrity of Ed Wood's films leaves a lot of interpretation, which we don't get with better films. So this was a great opportunity to take something planted in somewhat poor soil and let it bloom into something beautiful, like with the Corman films coming out of this. This is a great opportunity for us. Thank you so much, Brian. You're awesome.
No problem. And that's one of the things I want to do with. That's one of the things I've wanted to do with this podcast, is just so much of what you hear nowadays as far as movie discussion is just us versus them, as far as confrontational and just arguing about every little damn thing. And just the idea of people having a conversation where we can just talk about different topics and really identify.
Other film podcasts, and I won't call anybody out because they're doing fine work too. But there's a lot of other film podcasts where they just watch the movie and you can tell they got all their trivia off IMDb and they're just kind of reciting it. But there isn't really a conversation. And I guess if you're new to a certain genre or something, that can be helpful, but it's not nearly as interesting to me because I can look that stuff up myself.
So let me be hipster here and a little elitist. They're talking about movies. We're talking about film.
Yeah.
All right. With that, I am peacing out and letting Brian finally close his cast.
Bye, guys.
So thank you very much to Matt and Bailey. It was great to have this discussion. Coming up on the podcast, have some more individual film discussions before heading into a very busy 2019 with the podcast that I hope I will be able to survive the workload I'm about to give myself in discussing about the movies of 1999. But check me out on the Sonic Cinema Patreon at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. This is Brian Scuttle for the Sonic Cinema podcast, and thank you very much.